Leo Strauss on the limits of freedom. In what sense are we free? In Natural Right and History, his 1950 publication, Strauss retraces the genesis of modern individualism to the modern doctrine of individuals' autonomy, of the autonomous freedom of the modern individual. The modern world involves the rise of a new self. The modern world is one in which God serves as guarantor for an essentially godless self, a self constituted autonomously of any divine authority. In fact, of any authority that is not merely a function of man. How did we get there? Did we just evolve from monkeys to the modern autonomous self? And so the modern notion of freedom is something autonomous from secular and radically secular, and thus autonomous with respect to any authority that is not human. Strauss objected to this vision, and that we are otherwise raised with. This is the whole point of evolutionism. The doctrine of evolutionism, which goes hand in hand with the historicist doctrine, and so the modern sense of history, or the consciousness of a history. This is telling us that really our autonomy as individuals is grounded faithfully in the forces of the universe, of matter. Now, for Hegel, history is all about a logic which is ultimately eternal. So he says, well, you can't beat that. That our freedom, the individual, the modern individual's freedom is well grounded, he says. You can't dispute that logic. Well, it was disputed, of course, because it was also relying on the success of the modern liberal society. That success would be adequate proof, evidence at any rate, for the necessity of, the necessity grounding the rise of the modern individual self. Well, but that success of that society was obviously, dubious, and it showed to be dubious at the very least. So people hesitate even today, or after Hegel, people have hesitated, especially after the Second World War, scholars have hesitated to appeal to progress. We speak about merely evolution. Of course, the notion of evolution entails etymologically a sense of improvement, but we shy away from that because what is the standard? We have obviously changed. This change is mechanistic. Ultimately, even the way we speak about it is mechanistic. Of course, we can play with words and say, well, no, it transcends the machine. Yes, but you're speaking of it in mechanistic terms. So it is through mechanistic means or a mechanistic articulation of the problem that we are supposed to be, reaching some kind of understanding of the problem. All right, but what about freedom? If freedom is not grounded in the forces of history, and so if freedom is not ultimately, something that belongs to the modern individual, autonomous individual, right? As we learn about it from the likes of Descartes and Kant, the enlightened individual for Kant, right? Well, similarly for Descartes, in fact, already. Well, then what is freedom? In order to help us understand what freedom is and in what sense we are really and not simply hypothetically free, Strauss addresses the manner in which the modern is affected by, in fact, responds to the Middle Ages. What happens in the Middle Ages? In the Middle Ages, we have, again, scholars defending freedom, defending natural freedom, classical natural freedom, whatever that means, right? But we'll get to that. Strauss will get to that. Or he's already gotten to it, but he'll explain further. What does the medieval scholar do? Well, in order to defend natural freedom, he has to appeal to some kind of ground. How do we understand the ground of natural freedom? Now, since medieval man is faced with, so to some extent is the repository of a biblical revelation, he can obviously appeal to God as ground of his freedom. To better understand our freedom, or in what sense we are free, we appeal to God. But obviously, we don't all have access to the God of the Bible. And so we have a pagan world, of course, a classical tradition. We have obviously other people who don't know about the Bible. So what do? In some sense, we can appeal to something else that is not simply the biblical God, although it is second best. In other words, ultimately, it is the case that our freedom is grounded in God. But what about other kinds of grounding that are, well, derivative? And so the appeal was made to a kind of natural law by the likes of the Stoics prior to the intervention of the Bible, as it were. Right, but natural law has to be understood in a new way, given the fact that now we're exposed to the Bible. So, Leo Strauss addresses two formal positions, two ways of articulate this problem. One is represented by Thomas Aquinas, the other by Averroes, Ibn Rushd, or, in fact, the Latin Averroes, so-called. So, what is the way these two groups, these Thomists, and so Thomas Aquinas, the Christians and the Muslims, so to speak, but to speak very vague terms. Well, what is the way they articulate this problem of freedom? How do they account for our freedom? And what Strauss, this we've gone through, we've seen in a previous video here, a recording, and it is enough here to highlight the findings, as it were, right? Strauss's findings in succinct terms. So, on the Christian side, what you have is the tying of law to freedom. On the Muslim side, you have the tying of freedom to law. What does this mean? Well, in Thomas Aquinas, what you have is an attempt, of course, to justify our freedom. But how does he justify it? Well, he says, that this freedom is grounded in law. You cannot have a law without freedom. Why does he come to this conclusion? How does he come to this conclusion? Well, in order for freedom to be well grounded, it must be somehow originally within, already present, and eternally present in the law. That's the whole point of the filioque doctrine, which is to say that the Son is eternally present in the Father. Freedom is eternally present in law, in authority. And that's how we can interpret the law. We can partake in an understanding even of divine, of course, revelation. How can we? Well, that is because we partake in the Christ, and so Christ being eternally present and active in the Father, we are in the position of knowing the law. How can we know the law? Even if we are not familiar with the Bible, that's because we have a conscientia, right? A kind of knowledge that is within us, right? In other words, Christ is in our hearts, you could say. And this allows us to interpret law. We have access to the meaning of the law, ultimately the spirit of the law. So, law is tied to freedom. What's wrong with that? Well, not much, except for the fact that this binds, of course, freedom to the law to some extent, which is to say that whereas a kind of autonomy of freedom is preserved, there are certain, shall we say, legal limits that are imposed on freedom. And so ultimately what this means on philosophy. So we have a philosophy that is definitely welcome, but philosophy has to understand that there are certain criteria to respect. It's a little bit of saying that, yes, you can be free in a civil society, but you have to follow certain rules. You can't just do whatever you feel like doing. That's perfectly fine, except for the fact that some people might not like that. Some philosophers might say, no, we don't want to follow any rules. Right? There is nothing unchanging, and we can ultimately live our life as if there were no eternity, nothing permanent, right, to bind us to. All right, or at any rate, no God. So, what happens now with Islam? In the Islamic situation, what we have is the tying of freedom to law. So that you can't have any freedom without law. That's the emphasis. It's not that you can't have any law without freedom, but that you can't have any freedom without law. So all freedom is now natural freedom, natural right is conceived as legal. This is what Strauss points out, and this is, of course, accurate. And what this will also involve is that in Islam you will not have by and large, as a result of this articulation of the problem, right? It's not necessarily intended, right? That's the result. But as a result, you tend not to have any, how should we put it, any sphere of philosophy independent of the law, right? So the pagan tradition as such is not really respected, or to say the least, there's a lot of suspicion raised against it. Right? It is frowned upon, and it's very dangerous. Something that the Catholics, the medieval Christians, the Christians in general, to some extent, won't do. Generally, there's no Islamic suspicion in Christianity against the pagan tradition. You have noble pagans. Now, of course, within Islam you have exceptions. You have Farabi, you have Averroes himself, who will say, well, no, we're called to philosophize. But precisely in saying that God commands us to philosophize, what he's if he's not suggesting this, at any rate, the result will be that there's the idea that, yes, you can have some kind of philosophy, but it has to be legalistic. Right? So it's a legalistic philosophy. It's no longer really philosophy. It's something else, necessarily bound to laws, and ultimately that means Islamic law. Right. So either way, we have restrictions on classical philosophy, restrictions that the classics did not have. Now, there is an advantage, of course, to grounding natural freedom, especially within Christianity. What happens is that if freedom has access to the law, then obviously you can't condemn a philosopher for asking daring questions. Right? And that's why we have the most daring questions in the Middle Ages, articulated at length, debated, and so forth. Now, however, since this, shall we say, this link to the law is maintained, what we also have is a door open to, overemphasizing that link, and so, or misunderstanding or misconstruing it as an excuse to do away with philosophy altogether and reduce it to a doctrinal skeleton. Now, what about, and so something that resembles what happens with Islam, so a completely legalistic philosophy. There is, as Strauss points out, referring to Montesquieu, there is a rejection in the West of the medieval articulation of the problem. We could say that there's a rejection by sophists, but that would open up a can of worms, and we don't have to deal with that right now. Now, the rejection is raised in the name of a new freedom, and here is the point. The idea is that we have to have an autonomy, right, of freedom with respect to any kind of law, revelation, and so forth. Now, in this respect, the rise of modernity is closer to the Islamic alternative. What happened with Islam is that when law was attached to freedom, so that you cannot have freedom without law, what happened was a kind of contamination where all law seemed to be, aside from the eternal law of God, but seemed to be shifting in such a manner that we would come to this vision of an eternal law of God, of course, and our ordinary lives, which are really always shifting. The notion of a natural law, as we find in Christianity, is barely visible at this point. Right? What you have is a divine law that has to be imposed mechanistically, for the most part, on our lives. So a very strict regime. This, at any rate, seems to be the result of the Islamic articulation of the problem. What's wrong with that? Well, it's the rise of the modern mechanistic society. What you have is implicitly a freedom, not well defended, but it's there, to a kind of freedom, a mechanical freedom, to interpret a law, to administrate more, in the sense of administration, administrate a law imposed ex machina on our lives. And this is, of course, the great drama of Islam. The loss of traditional natural reason and so interpretation of law. Now, this, incidentally, also is the drama we face today, because with the modern individual, and so the modern notion of individual autonomous freedom, what we have is a sphere of life that is supposed to be constituted autonomously of, well, divine intelligence and authority, of course. So, what is it going to be grounding itself in? If it cannot ground itself in God, what is it grounding itself in? If God's mind is utterly inaccessible to us because it is not part of the constitution of the makeup of our freedom. Our freedom, again, is autonomous. Then what is our autonomy grounded in? It turns out that it's evolving mechanistically from the passions, from fear, from material forces, compulsions. So it is the stepson or the byproduct of compulsions. Where do these compulsions come from? Oh, well, we can say that they ultimately, the result in a fallen world, right? The result of God, they come from God. We have had a fall from God. But again, God intervenes, if he ever intervenes, as a hand from outside, as a mechanical arm that saves us. By and large, in the modern world, what we have is precisely this. We have a mechanistic approach to nature and man, and maybe an appeal to God. Maybe. Not necessary, but if we have it, it certainly encourages our mechanistic approach, our mechanistic life. So we have the doctrine of evolution. We have also intelligent design theory. So in both cases, what we have is a mechanistic approach to life, whether or not it appeals ultimately to God. Now, Strauss says, well, look, this is not going to work because it feeds into the machine, and so the end of freedom. Machine means no freedom, fake freedom. It's compulsion. A machine functions by compulsion. AI, whatever you want to call it, it's all the expression of compulsion. Orders, rules, mechanisms. But freedom itself is not, natural freedom, is not based on compulsion. So, what is the truth about freedom? Well, in classical terms, freedom, if it is not based on it is not, in fact, something that belongs to the autonomous individual. So if it's not cut off from divine necessity in any way, and yet it is not fixed, then what is it? Now, the Christian response to this question may be right on the mark. The problem is that a certain articulation leads to a misunderstanding. What is freedom grounded in? That is obvious divine necessity. In classical terms, what this means is that freedom is an articulation, is an expression, if you like, a manifestation even, of divine intelligence. Intelligence is at work in freedom. Freedom belongs to God. We say, well, what about man? Man is an image, a mask, if you like, of intelligence, of divine intelligence. That mask cannot be resolved in man. In other words, it cannot resolve itself. Man has no solution to the problem of man. The solution to the problem of man is found in God. So it is only by ascending to God that we can find solstice, we can find peace, we can restore ourselves. It is only by turning back to divine necessity, understood as intelligence, because that's the whole point. If freedom is originally within a necessity, then necessity must be intelligible. If it is not originally within necessity, then necessity ultimately is mechanistic, beyond freedom. So this is where Christianity and the tradition of Maimonides, right, agree on. Right? This is where Strauss is calling us back to, right? Maimonides / Thomas Aquinas in their proper understanding. Strauss quotes Thomas pretty much as he would anybody else, if not more. Strauss was not a Christian, but that doesn't mean anything, because we're speaking in formalistic terms, and what is more, we're speaking in a modern context. What does it mean to be a Christian? Does it mean to belong to a church? Then Jesus was not a Christian, because he doesn't belong to, a formal church, right? Jesus does not. Then what is more, his disciples are not Christians, because they are living before the constitution of a formal church. Well, we could say that there is such a thing as a Jewish church, but these are simply formal distinctions, and they're not really of the essence. What is of the essence is the life of the understanding, the life of freedom, of participation in divine necessity. How do we partake in divine necessity? First of all, through recognition that we have no autonomy, that we are masks, that there's no such thing as the self as mind on his own. That's a Cartesian illusion. The self is, when I say all this, I, is simply a mask in which two elements come in together, which is to say mind and body, determination, and the essentially inherently indeterminate. So we have the determination, and the indeterminate. Right? Peros aperon. So in Greek terms, we have the same problem, and it is something about reality that we intuit, that is given to us rather to intuit. It's part of our makeup, right? We have these two elements, the finite and the indefinite. So we are the place where these two meet. And that doesn't mean that we are the ones who are in charge. It means that we're the place where these two meet, these two poles. And they play out. There's an articulation. We are the place where this articulation takes place. We are masks. Once you open up that mask, you see what the problems are underlying it. What underlies the modern self? Well, supposedly mechanistic forces, blind forces, impervious to all freedom and reason. We can't reason about the ground of freedom, says Kant. Well, not so, says the classical Platonic tradition that Leo Strauss appeals to for our sake.